Okay, so here's a closer view of an artillery cannon. You can see this is obviously a very heavy weapon, and the length of the barrel here often determined, how far a cannon could fire and how heavy um, the shell it could fire. So, some of these cannons, this is not, this is, I would say an average sized artillery cannon here. And it would have been able, certainly destructive, but they had much larger weapons that came later into the war, with barrels that were as long as like a telephone pole that could fire huge, enormous shells, great distance. So, you can see that this device here was constructed in such a way that it could be towed into place. So it had wheels. It also needed these wheels because it recoiled quite violently once the barrel was discharged. You can see these wheels here sort of determine two things. They would move the barrel sort of very slightly right or left, and they also would raise or lower the barrel, and that determined how far and how much of a radius here that the cannon itself could fire at. So, it's a bit of a guessing game in terms of artillery here. You also might notice here that they had to peg into the ground these cannons because when they discharged, if there was nothing holding this piece in place, the cannon would have just recoiled violently here and would have taken off, and that of course would limit its accuracy as well. Plus, it was very dangerous. Tremendous amounts of hearing loss. So these guys that operated these cannons, most of them would have suffered total hearing loss, in one ear or the other, or in some cases in both ears as a result of the massive sounds that came from these cannons. This is an interesting shot here. We've got, this is an underground bunker. We would have seen this here maybe in the supporting trench, and you can see a little more relaxed here. Lots of guys, obviously, so that you needed to have those men in reserve if they were called upon. But because they weren't on frontline duty, they could, take a bit of a break. And normally they would be sort of cycled in through the trenches here in 1 week periods or 1 week blocks. So you do a week in the reserve, a week in the supporting trench, and then a week in the front lines, and then you would work your way back. So then back to the support trench, back to the reserve, and then they would be given a period where they would have some rest away from the battlefield. Because it was recognized that trench warfare was hard on men. So these guys here, a little bit more lighthearted, even playing cards, as you can see. This is an interesting shot here. You can see that this is an individual, quite young, very dirty here. Which you're wondering what's going on. Well, he's got a bucket, obviously. What is he doing? Well, the trenches, part of the problem we know is the trenches filled up with water, rainwater, and they would have to make efforts to try to drain the trenches from that water. But in this case here, that's not what this young lad's doing. Knowing that the men had lived in the trenches, they ate in the trenches, they did everything, they couldn't leave. They also had to go to the washroom. So there were sections of the trench that was simply called the latrine, and it was like a cutout where men would go in, and it was basically just an even deeper pit where men would go and do their business. Well, there were lots of men in the trenches, and this was a long war. Those latrines filled up, and they would often fill up with water. Now, of course, you wouldn't want the latrine to flood, so it had to be emptied. And you can see why this young guy here was not too happy about what's going on. He's emptying the latrine. This is a good shot we've got here. We can see, so this would probably be, in some section of the trench itself that would have been considered a communication post. And you can tell these are higher ranking officers, not just because of their attire. He's got a, shirt and tie on here. But because of the fact that they had maps exposed to them, and this would have been a radio here that these guys would have been able to use to communicate with the various parts of the trenches. So they're doing some sort of, planning here, some communicating, but this would have been reserved exclusively for officers of a higher class. The average infantryman, especially in World War I, the average foot soldier didn't ask questions. They just followed orders. And the risk here of asking questions or of not following orders was insubordination. And insubordination in World War I was dealt with quite swiftly and severely. Oftentimes men were executed. So we've got some officer class here.